Okay, hello everyone. This is the sort of techie, I don't know how techie it's been the rest of the afternoon, but it's pretty hard to have the techie stuff at the end of the day. But this is going to be techie, this is real content stuff, and it's super interesting because you've had a lot of big numbers offered up at COP, a lot of financial institutions who are making commitments, a lot of companies making commitments. But in the end, it all comes down to data. Data, data, data. When you ask them, what's the thing you're really missing? And they always say it's data. Data on nature. Data on nature. So there are a host of different organizations that are coming up with different ways of doing data. I mean, just a few minutes ago, we were down on the water there with Nature Metrics, collecting water samples from Loch Lomond. And in the old days, when I was a biologist, if you wanted to know the species living in the lake, it meant, days of catching them in nets and looking at them, or fishing, or bugs. It took a long time. We just get some samples, you push them through a filter, and then you put the filter in a machine, and it will give us not only one species, but all the species that are in the lake, or vertebrates, that have pooed in the lake, peed in the lake, or swim in the lake, all done by eDNA. So this sort of stuff is revolutionizing the data gathering process. So we're going to hear on our panel now from several people who are right at the forefront of all this, and also from a financial institution that is also at the forefront of this. So before I introduce Nikki, we're going to have Emine now I'm going to try and do the Turkish version of this. Emine Isciel.
Perfect.
That's not bad, is it?
That's not
okay.
bad.
All right. So Emine is going to be talking from the point of view of Storebrand as a sort of user of this kind of data. We're also going to hear from Emma about Forest 500, which some of you may know, and we're also going to hear then after that from James Phare, who looks far into the supply chains, and with Neural Alpha, an amazing work with Trase for finance. That's looking all the way down the supply chains and looking where the finance coming from in these supply chains. And also we're going to have online Clara Melot, there she is, Clara, hello, who's going to talk to us about SPOTT, which is a ZSL thing some of you may know about, again, looking at commodities in supply chains. And then we're going to think about, well, how do you bring all that together in some sort of alignment? And that's Sarah's job, down the end, Sarah Rogerson from Global Canopy. I should say that also Emma's from Global Canopy. So she's going to try and bring it all together at the end. But before that, I'm going to introduce Nikki Mardas, who's the sort of maestro behind all this as the chief executive of Global Canopy. And so Nikki has turned Global Canopy from a bunch of scientists swinging on climbing ropes in the treetops, which is when I started it, into a leading sort of data for nature provider. So, Nikki, over to you to say a few words of introduction. Thank you, Nikki.
Great, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm Nikki Mardas, Executive Director of Global Canopy. And we have moved into the data space, but I'm not going to speak about data. I'll leave that to my much more knowledgeable colleagues. I do want to speak a little bit about the politics that we've seen over the last few days. And as we heard earlier, COP26 started with really a quite intense statement of intent on nature. And it was no accident. The UK presidency made sure to put nature at the heart of this COP. They had identified its critical importance that we all knew, but that it wasn't being talked about at the right level by the leaders with commitments backing it. So we had the Glasgow Declaration of Forests 2 days ago. I think it's 2 days. It seems like a long time ago now, which was a remarkable coming together of 105, I think it's grown to 130 countries making commitments to end deforestation by 2030. Now, we've already heard the critique, which is a fair one we have to keep in mind. We've heard this all before. We heard this in 2014. How is this different? I do think it's different. We have 85% of the world's forests represented. It's now gone up to 90%. And we've got Brazil at the table. We've got Russia, it's boreal forests, all types of forests involved too. And that's new. But we've also got China at the table. That's 25% of the market for commodities that drive deforestation, soy, palm oil, beef, well known by now. We've got 25% of that market in one country, going through one country, alongside now Europe. They've made commitments on this for many years to really, really encapsulate the market for deforestation products. So it's opened up a new political space. We saw a host of other commitments that bring all the different actors that need to be at the table to the table. And we saw money too, 20 billion in commitments, a mix of private, public, and philanthropy commitments for this problem, to tackle this problem. We'll need to see more money, of course, especially when we think about the financing that is arrayed against, or that goes into, the supply chains, the commodities, the agricultural expansion that destroys nature and forests. And we heard earlier today about that imbalance between the two. And we've got, around about $1 trillion in financing into these supply chains. Trase finance that James has pioneered with others tracks around about that amount of finance. And we've got agricultural subsidies and other sources of finance that are pointing in the other direction, which is why it's so important that as a part of this suite of commitments, we've seen 30-plus financial institutions, and we hope there'll be many more, but we've seen 30-plus financial institutions step up with 9 trillion almost in assets under management to say that they will work on eliminating deforestation from their portfolios by 2025. And we have one of the leaders with us, Emine. Her institution, Storebrand, has been a leader in this space for many years and has joined this commitment. So we'll hear more about that. And Andrew earlier talked about Bologna, Melonia, and Trilonia. Well, I got the order wrong. But, we're in the Trilonia territory where we need to be with these commitments, or with the financial institutions coming on board. But the $1 trillion question remains how. How are we going to do this? That's the really, really big question. And so yesterday with partners, we launched something called Guidance for Deforestation-Free Finance, which Emma Thompson here led on with other colleagues, which lays out a 5-step plan for tackling deforestation in portfolios. You can see it online at deforestation-freefinance.org. It's going to build, it's going to grow, it's going to improve. But that's guidance which begins to answer that question of how do we do this by 2025? Someone said it's only about 1,000 days away. This sounds a long way away, but it's really not that far away at all. And we'll hear more about that from Emine. The other question is metrics, the other part of the how question. We heard about that in the first session on the TNFD. How do we get aligned metrics so we can actually know which are the companies that are doing well, which are the companies that are doing less well? And we're going to hear about this challenge today. It's the second critical piece of the puzzle on how. And with deforestation, nature meets climate. It's a great place for us to dig in and really try and answer this question so that we can get to an answer for biodiversity more broadly, for nature more broadly. Forests are one of the really important places to start among many others. So with that, I'll hand back to Andrew, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so I feel I'm quite redundant up here, really. So I'm just going to pass it really to Emine to tell us what your perspectives are from Storebrand's point of view.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me well. So I come from Storebrand Asset Management. We like to think we're big, but when I'm out in the world, most people have not heard of us, but we're Norway's largest private asset manager. And I work there on environmental and climate issues. So I'm personally very pleased to be in a panel on deforestation, because over the years I have seen that deforestation has struggled to get the attention and action it rightly deserves, but that is slowly changing. investors are increasingly recognizing financial risks associated with deforestation. And the commitment yesterday from 30 financial institutions, it's evidence of that. And I think our industry has made, significant progress in understanding climate change, climate risk, identifying risk and managing it. But for obvious reasons, we have looked at energy and transport, but we have forgot our best ally in the fight against mitigation and adaptation, nature. And forests are, important ecosystem, not only for climate change, but for water, for biodiversity, indigenous rights, and so on. So we are, of course, pleased to see this joint commitment from the financial industry, and the real job, it really starts now, translating the commitment into concrete actions. And I think it was David Blood yesterday in a panel who said, I tried to write it down because Nikki was also writing, so I had to write something smart down. So he said, the road from Glasgow is way more important than the road to Glasgow. And so I would like to talk a little bit about our work in Storebrand. So we have worked on sustainability for 25 years, on deforestation for 10 years. We started with palm oil, and in 2019, we made a commitment, similar to the one you saw 2 days ago, that we will have deforestation-free portfolios by 2025. So we already had a similar commitment, like the one we saw 2 days ago. And we widened the scope of our policy, and we said we're not only going to look at the palm oil, but we'll also look at other main drivers. We'll look at soy, cattle, timber, but we'll also look at indirect financing, because we had divested from companies in the palm oil sector, and we were invested in banks in Asia that were providing loan to the same companies that we didn't want to be associated with. And our policy is quite flexible. Let's say Global Canopy or an NGO says, look, rubber is the main driver, or cacao or something else, and we have the tools for infrastructure mining. We will start looking at that as well. But the soft commodity angle is practical, because that's what we have. Currently, that's what we have the tools to identify our investee companies linked to deforestation. So we had the policy adopted by the executive management in 2019, and little did I know how complex this issue was, because supply chains are very complex. So we start to look at our main ESG data providers, the main providers used by investors, such as Sustainalytics, MSCI, Bloomberg. Most of them, they don't have any data on deforestation. And if they do, it's at the policy level, so it's not sufficient for our purposes. So we teamed up with another financial institution in Norway called KLP and Rainforest Foundation Norway. It's an NGO in Norway. And we did a desk review. We looked at, we don't have data from the main data providers, but we have other tools. Maybe they're not developed for us, but we can still use them. So we assessed 10 leading tools that investors can use, Forest 500, Trase, and so on. And the conclusion, in very short, I know I only have 3 minutes, but the conclusion is short, is that there is no one perfect tool out there, but you can combine various tools, and you can actually, you don't need the most advanced data to drive change, you just need the right data, and we have that data for investors to start identifying risk, mapping their portfolios. So what we did in Storebrand was that we combined Forest 500, which Emma will talk more about, identifying the most influential companies. But it's self-reported data, and it only tells about risk awareness. It doesn't say much about exposure or practice. So we combined that with Trase, and which is more satellite data, and you will talk more about that. And we identified 50 companies at risk. It's both companies and banks. And these are the companies that we will focus on and engage with in the coming months and years. And the methodology is not perfect. We will develop as new tools develop and we get more data. But of course, the ideal in an ideal world, it will be mainstreamed into the main ESG data providers, so everybody could use them, and you don't need to spend, you don't need to go outside and spend so much resources and efforts, and everybody can mainstream, make this part of their ESG analysis. Currently, it's not part of the data, so it's not in our Excel sheets, to put it like that. So,
Emine, can I just, I want to ask you, we need to move on to the other, but I have a question just to ask you, because where was the deforestation in your portfolio? Was it through soy, or was it through
It's
other
everywhere.
commodities?
It's
or-
everywhere. It's upstream, downstream, and that's the challenge with deforestation because it's really everywhere. And we are mostly, you know, the various investors, but most investors, I think, would be more exposed to downstream companies than upstream. Most upstream companies, they can be unlisted. And it's easier to identify, the further down you go in the supply chain, it's more difficult to identify responsibilities. So, yeah.
Okay,
I'll
fascinating.
move-
Okay,
I'll
we'll
move
leave it there
quickly.
because
Thank you.
I want to make sure we get through the rest of the panel, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end and your chance to ask some questions, and we'll see where we go. So Emma Thompson is working at Global Canopy, and we had this idea. Do you remember the Fortune 500, that magazine? Well, Nikki thought, why don't we have a Forest 500? And we picked the 500 biggest entities that are involved in deforestation, good and bad, and we rank them. So Emma's going to tell us how she does it. Emma, over to you.
Thank you. It's not just me, there's a team of us, but yeah. So
Do you want to? Yeah, you're doing slides.
I've got
I'm
it,
gonna
yeah,
get out of the
thank
way.
you. So as Andrew said, in 2014, Forest 500 was started to hold the companies and financial institutions accountable to the voluntary deforestation commitments that they were making as part of initiatives like the NYDF and the Consumer Goods Forum. And so to do that, Forest 500 identifies the 500 companies and financial institutions with the greatest influence on tropical deforestation, and then we assess them on the strength and implementation of their deforestation commitments. So to do that, we first select the 350 companies. So we reselect the full Forest 500 every 2 years, and we do this selection based on their exposure to deforestation risk. So firstly, we identify the producer countries that are producing the highest volumes of palm oil, soy, beef, leather, timber, and pulp and paper. And we also then identify the trading countries which are providing or are importing and exporting the greatest value of those commodities. Then once we've done that, we use that as a guide to inform our selection of the companies. So we select 350 companies that are exposed, have the greatest exposure to these 6 commodities. And all 350 companies are spread throughout the supply chain, so from producers through to traders through to retailers. Depending on the stage of their supply chain and the commodity that we're looking at, we use different metrics to select them, but they're all selected for at least one commodity, and we call them power brokers for that commodity, which means they have the greatest exposure to deforestation risk through that commodity. But we do assess them for any of those 6 commodities that they're exposed to. Once you've selected the companies, we then identify the 150 financial institutions which are providing the most finance to those companies. So that's through bond holdings, loans and underwritings, and shareholdings. And as you can see, the financial institutions are assessed for 4 commodities, which are the 6 grouped together. So we have palm oil, soy, timber products, and cattle products. So moving on to the assessments themselves. The Forest 500 assessments are an annual process. So we assess them on the strength and implementation of their commitments on deforestation and associated social issues and human rights. So we have 2 different methodologies. The one for companies assesses them on the commitments that they have for their supply chain and their suppliers. And for financial institutions, it looks at the policies they have in place for the clients and holdings that they finance. Both of our methodologies are now aligned with the Accountability Framework's common methodology, and so we're assessing them against best practice for the industry. All our assessments are done using publicly available information, so anything that's published on the company or financial institution websites is used in the assessment, and we assess them in their native language as well. Every January, we publish our entire data set on forest500.org, so it's all publicly available, and that includes their scores, but also the quotes and the links that we use to score them for each indicator. So, onto the uses of the Forest 500 data. There are many uses. It's a very extensive data set, but I was just going to focus on 3 today. So the first one is identifying highly exposed clients or holdings. So if a client is included in the Forest 500, it's because they have, or one of the clients or the companies or financial institutions with the greatest exposure to tropical deforestation risk. So that means that in high-level risk assessments, they can be clearly identified as a company or bank to look into in greater detail. Another use is to benchmark companies and financial institutions against each other. So all of the Forest 500 scores across companies and financial institutions are directly comparable against each other. So that counts for each indicator, each section of our methodology, and also their total score as a company or financial institution. Because they are comparable, you can compare the strength and implementation of their policies across all 500 and compare them against others in similar sectors. As you can see on the screen, the quotes and the links are also there, which means that you can use that to dig into even greater detail about what the client or holding is doing. You can look through their website at exactly what we used to assess them for that indicator. And a final use to talk about is how it can be used for engagement with clients or holdings. Because the assessments are assessing them against best practice for the sector, if a client or holding doesn't score for a particular indicator or even a whole section, that identifies a clear gap in their approach on deforestation and human rights. So you can use that to dig deeper in conversations with them, but also it can be used to show what actions the client or holding can take next to improve their approach on deforestation. I think that's the end of my time, so I will hand back over to Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And, I think the limitation, I suppose, is that this is about policies, right? But we don't know how well they're implementing the policies.
So our next round of assessments, 50% of company scores will be based on how they're going about implementing their commitments. So although we can't see what they're doing on the ground, we can look at the key indicators about how they're talking about it.
They will have to tell you, this is how we're going to implement policy. We don't know whether they'll actually do it, but at least they'll have a plan. So you'll be able to assess the plan.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a step forward. Good, thank you. So James. Now it's your turn. It's slightly different. One thing was to sort of trace all this stuff and where it goes through trace.earth. You might know that. If those of you don't, there's a wonderful tool called trace.earth, which sort of traces where the commodities come from and where they're going to across the world. So like soy and palm oil. That's pretty difficult to do, by the way. Then you've got the policy part, which is, well, do they have policies? You can be importing the commodities, but have no policy at all about whether it's involved in deforestation or not, so that's not good. So first we know where it's coming from, where it's going to. Now we know whether they've got a policy, and the companies and the traders and all the people in that thing. But who's paying for it all? Where's the money coming from that fuels that whole supply chain? And that's what James is going to tell us a bit more about. So over to you, James.
Thanks, Andrew. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Yeah. Great. So Trace Finance, I guess, is quite a different platform to other platforms. So we don't really focus on the policy dimension very much. So obviously, policy dimension being a forward-looking dimension, we mainly look backwards. So Trace Finance builds on the pioneering science-based research of Trace Earth in terms of looking through commodity supply chains for commodities such as Brazilian beef, Brazilian soy, Indonesian palm, and essentially using modelling techniques to allocate deforestation in hectares to different commodity traders that are active in exporting these commodities around the world. So what this allows us to do is take a very unique approach at analysing risk, and particularly financial risk. So what we do with Trace Finance is we essentially have built a financial layer to ask the question, how are financial institutions exposed to deforestation, and to what extent? And what do those direct exposures look like, and what do those indirect exposures look like? So it's always a good idea right at the end of the day to hit people with numbers and data. So put together a quick slide just to run through an example. So Piauí is a frontier state. It's a soy-producing state in the Mata Piba region of Brazil. You have around 5,000 hectares of deforestation that we can prove is happening each year using satellite data. Around 70% of that deforestation we can allocate to around 11 mostly publicly listed commodity traders operating in that region. If we then look through that supply chain, we can see that the average commodity trader has 2 immediate customers. If we then start to look even further at who owns those companies, we can start to do some really interesting things. So we can start to for instance, assign deforestation risk to financial institutions, to funds, we can calculate what the footprint in hectares is for, you know, an ETF or a mutual fund that people would invest in on the street. So we do this every month, and we calculate over 400,000 equity positions. We calculate the deforestation risk in hectares for those. So looking at Piauí, you know, Piauí is a really simple example, one of 28 soy-producing states in Brazil. You have over 4,000 directly exposed funds, 5,500 institutional investors. So this is direct equity exposure. Thinking about indirect risks, which Emine touched on earlier, you can start to see, you know, you have 67 banks directly lending and exposed to Piauí. So you have the credit risk angle. Then looking at indirect risks, those banks have 1,600 institutional investors. So the simple answer is who is exposed? Everyone is exposed, and it's pervasive. So what tools do we try to provide to help investors tackle this problem? Well, first of all, we have a huge database. We cover over 400,000 financial institutions and commodity traders. We provide screens to examine the profiles of different companies. This is a brewing company with a deforestation footprint. We also provide search tools. So this is particularly used for local banks who are doing due diligence on prospective customers. We can search based on tax IDs, common financial identifiers, or names, as is often the case. We also provide tools for uploading portfolios, so for uploading issuers, for uploading holdings, and then starting to screen those portfolios. So you can examine your risks in terms of risks associated with sourcing regions. You can also rank your constituents in your portfolio based on risks. Finally, the other tools that we provide are really focused around targeted engagements. So we see on the right-hand side, this is a legal structure of a well-known commodity trader, and the nodes are resized based on the risk footprint in hectares. So this is a real game changer in terms of allowing institutional investors to have very, very targeted engagements on specific problematic subsidiaries, acquisitions, joint ventures, so on and so forth. Often the legal structures are not necessarily as tidy as the one on the right, though. The one on the left is an example of more of an Indonesian structure, very informal, lots of common directorship links, harder to prove, you know, legal risk and control. But obviously, you can only go so far in terms of understanding this complexity with front-end tools, with data visualizations, and it is all about the data and bringing these tools together. So we also offer a range of tools to automate and allow financial institutions to integrate this data in-house into ESG reporting tools, investment management tools, risk reporting tools, and so on. We offer APIs, we offer bulk data products, and we also offer services to help with deeper screening. So going beyond issuers down to particular securities, physical assets, and other more specific entities to screen. And that's pretty much it in terms of a whistle-stop tour of Trase Finance. Hopefully I'm running reasonably to time.
James, thank you very much. Just a huge amount of data that's been sifted through, amassed, shell companies unpicked. It's amazing. 400,000 data point entities or data points in there. I mean, absolutely huge. And actually, there are 6 banks I've got here, major ones that are in Scotland: Baillie Gifford, Egen, ABRDN, Scottish Widows, NatWest, Royal London. So if any of you are in the room, if you'd like to buy James or myself a wee dram at the bar afterwards, we'll tell you what your forest footprint is. So we're now going to go virtual because Clara Melot is there waiting, and she's going to tell us about SPOTT. We're reasonably on time, Clara, but if you could go just as fast as you can, we want to leave some time for Q&A. So if I have to cut you off, please do forgive me. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me today. I'll be presenting SPOTT today. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'll keep it short. Spot is a free online platform which is here to help bring out the transparency among upstream commodity producers. We currently assess over 200 of the world's largest producers and traders of palm oil, timber and pulp, and natural rubber. I should insist on the natural rubber aspect because that's really a unique aspect of our tool, and there's not very much data on this sector otherwise, and we'll be taking the number to 230 come the spring in terms of coverage. The companies that we assess are assessed on the public disclosure of policies, operations, and practices, and the themes that we cover are listed on the right-hand side of the slide. For those of you who might not be able to see it because it's quite small, I'll go through it very quickly, but we cover sustainability and general leadership issues, land bank issues, mapping and traceability, certification, deforestation and biodiversity, impact assessments, peat, soils, fire, and GHG emission, everything related to water and water quality, as well as pest management, community land and labor rights, smallholders and suppliers, and finally, governance and grievances. And the aim of the tool is really to support financial institutions and supply chain companies to inform investment and purchasing decisions, as well as engagement practices, with engagement key being the key word here. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little hint of what it looks like, all these assessments that we produce end up providing a scorecard for each sector, and for which you can see information about the score, but also score change over time because the companies are assessed again year on year. You can see whether companies have engaged and provided feedback on their assessments, and you can sort them through by headquarters, land bank, and also the amount of media coverage they have and controversies. But then you can also click on the company's profile and access the very detailed breakdown of all the points they obtained and why, as well as the notes made by the assessor, which should save a lot of time to any of you if you want to look at any given company. Next slide, please. So in terms of the assessment, one specificity of Spot as well is that we do not only cover listed companies, we look at a number of private organizations, and that also means that it can be useful on the banking side, but also private equity side practitioners. There's 100 companies for timber and pulp, 100 for palm oil, and 15, soon 30 for rubber. And for rubber, because of the structure of the supply chain, by adding more companies, we very fast reached the point where we're now assessing tire manufacturers. So you can see a list of the companies that are assessed online, but that includes very big companies, like, for example, Michelin or Kumho Tires or Yokohama Rubber Company. They'll be assessed next year. Next slide, please. The way we select the companies is based on where they operate and how much land footprint they have, either through the land that they actually control or operate on, or the kind of impact they have in terms of volumes. And we try to go from the biggest in the industry and add companies over time. We are also taking nominations from interested stakeholders, but we weigh that against the impact effort we try to have on biodiversity conservation. Again, looking at how big those companies are. Next slide, please. The way we assess companies is based on public information, so website, reports, and other trustworthy resources. But I should add also that in terms of indicators, we have information about whether general company information, but also policies and commitments, targets for improvements, and what they report about how they progress on the reporting. So for example, do they have a commitment to no deforestation, but also does that apply to suppliers? Are they monitoring deforestation, and are they reporting on any non-compliant deforestation? And while this is a bit more information to help you understand how the policies are implemented, it's really important to keep in mind that we don't verify this information on the ground. And so commitments, and they can be a mismatch between the commitments and the actual practices. Next slide, please. One key aspect also is that we engage with companies when we assess them. So we tell them they're going to be assessed, and then we carry out the assessment ourselves, working with consultants based on publicly available information. But then we give companies a chance to either criticize, comment, get feedback on the assessment, but also publish more information if they want their score to go up. And we do this as a cycle every year, which means that over time we can see progress in the disclosures that can be used by all stakeholders in company engagement. Next slide, please. A last comment is that based on all of this data, which is currently downloadable on Spot, but will also be made available through the partnership we'll be discussing later, we can produce a lot of knowledge, and we try and share that based on, on the findings we have based on the data every year. So please feel free to reach out for any more information. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Clara. You did a great job whizzing through all that. Super interesting stuff. And Spot has been around for quite a long time. I can't remember, when did you start it? Did you say it wasn't 2014? It was earlier than that. 2014.
For some companies, we have up to 6 years of data.
So it's got a lot of data. So really good stuff. Thank you very much from ZSL. So now, you've heard a range of different things. It's now, Sarah, Sarah, you've got a tough job. How do you pull all this together? And tell us about this aligned accountability project.
Thanks, Andrew. So I think, as Andrew said in his introduction, we often hear that lack of data is one of the biggest challenges for financial institutions trying to look at how to make their portfolios or their investments greener. But as we've been hearing here, when we look at deforestation in particular, there are a lot of tools already out there. There is a lot of data. So yeah, and from Emine, that data is good enough to get going. So I wanted to talk about how we're bringing those data sets together. We still do hear a few kind of challenges from financial institutions on how, when they're trying to use these existing data sets, the challenges that they're facing. So there's kind of reflections that these are multiple tools with different data points, different frameworks, and it's difficult to work out how to bring them together. Occasionally there's challenges with accessing the data. There's limited coverage within these data sets, so comparing it to a huge portfolio from a financial institution, we're only covering maybe sometimes a few hundred. And then finally, some of these data sets cover policies, commitments, as we've heard, some cover exposure, but it's really valuable to bring those together, as Emine's covered. And also, we need to move away from these assessments of policies and to get better assessments of true impact of these companies as well. So aligned accountability, our project, we're aiming to address each of these, so I can talk through this. So aligned accountability is a partnership project, which we're really excited to be working with a huge number of our close partners. So with ZSL SPOTT, with the Trase initiative, and with many others that you see on the screen. And of course, none of us would be here today without the generous funding of the Norwegian International Climate and Forest Initiative. So we are going to create a common database of company performance on deforestation. So we want to bring all these different data sets together into one place to make it easier to access it, easier to understand how it all fits together. By doing that, we'll then be able to get greater coverage of companies, bringing these different samples together. But we'll also be able to get a better assessment of company performance by bringing those complementary data sets together. So the data on commitments, policies, with data on certification, with data on exposure to risk. All of the partners are working really closely with the Accountability Framework Initiative. So we're all working on how to better align our assessments of company performance, not only to each other, but also to the industry standard guidance that the Accountability Framework has created, so that we're assessing companies against what they're also being told to do when they're tackling deforestation in their supply chains. And we're also working with the Accountability Framework on that kind of next step. How do we continue to improve these assessments and get better assessments of outcomes and impact on the ground? So our target audience for this data set is really the finance sector, and that's because we see such a huge opportunity to use the leverage of that sector to move companies to improve their practices. And we've seen that this week with all the commitments as well. But we're also focusing on ESG data providers and ratings agencies, as Emine said, such a really important route for us to be able to mainstream the use of this data. And there's many out there that don't include deforestation in their ESG ratings, or if they do, it's kind of 1 or 2 data points. So we want to make sure that we're bringing this data together and making it available to them to improve those assessments of companies. So I just wanted to go back to these challenges and kind of go through each of one and how we're going to address them through aligned accountability. So multiple tools with different methodologies and scores. Obviously, by bringing them together, we are going to make it easier to understand how they all fit together. But also, it will help us with our work, with the Accountability Framework Initiative and others, on that alignment piece. How are we assessing companies? Are we all assessing them in the same way and pushing them in the same direction? Accessibility of data. So we're building the database and we're working with a working group of 10 financial institutions, looking at, how are we creating this? How do they need to be able to access it so it fits in with their existing processes? So does that need to be a data download, APIs, what have you? We've brought them on board at the very beginning before we've started building anything so that we can build it how they need it. One of the other key parts of the accessibility that we're kind of aware of as well is mapping the companies to identifiers that are commonly used by financial institutions. So a lot of our data sets, including Forest 500 that we run, don't have that kind of coverage, and that's a really big priority for us. We'll be building off the work of Trase Finance on that piece as well. I think this is changing. In terms of coverage, obviously bringing the data sets together, we're immediately going to have more coverage than each of our individual initiatives on our own. But it will also put us in a better position to assess the gaps in the data and where we need to expand our data collection. We're working with the financial institutions in our working group as well to identify what are the key metrics that they need on each company, so to narrow it down so we can expand our data collection by focusing in on just the core data points that we need to collect. And then finally, obviously connecting data sets on commitments and policies to exposure is just the core part of aligned accountability, bringing together these data sets. But then, as I said before, thinking about that next step, thinking about how we continue to improve the metrics that we have in there, how do we assess outcomes that companies are having on the ground, the impact. So we'll be continuing to work with our partners, with the accountability framework, to move that along, and the database will be constantly updated and added. These data points will be added as they improve as well, so we can really move to a better assessment. I will stop there. Thanks, Andy.
So, well done. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, look, we've got a few minutes, and the bar is opening very soon. So this is a terrible time to have a Q&A. I just wanted to give you the opportunity, if there were any people who would like to ask a question. Now's the time. Yes.
This is very different.
Yeah, I know.
Thanks very much, Andrew Kay from Baillie Gifford. So yeah, I would be interested in speaking afterwards. Just to
well, the bar is just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I will be brief. Yeah, I mean, one thing I think which is really interesting in asset management going on is just with the sheer amount of data and transparency and challenge around responsible, sustainable investing. Is there a danger that funds increasingly gravitate towards sort of safe investments, and then there's a sort of privatization of all the sort of difficult stuff? So high impact. Commodities and products become entirely privatized and therefore less accessible to engagement and action from outside stakeholders.
What do you think about that, Emine? Is it all going to go to private equity so they don't have to report anything anymore?
No, I don't think so, because as I said, deforestation is in a way everywhere. It's banks. We are mostly exposed through downstream companies. Food companies. We've been engaging with seafood companies in Norway. They buy the soy from Brazil. So I don't think that will be the case.
It is an issue, though, because there is a lot of listed money moving into private equity, apparently. And so I think what's interesting is, well, how do you get private equity to report on anything when they don't have to? And yet they can have a big negative impact if they're not held to account. It's quite a question. I don't know if anyone's a PE player in the room who can help us answer that, but I think that's going to become an issue coming up. they're not going to be allowed to just do that. Anyone?
We have a case study on this on the way Color Capital has approached deforestation, and they are even more particular in their approach because they are actually secondaries in the secondaries market, and it's more indirect, and they engage with their GPs, which then might decide to bring up issues with portfolios. I'm absolutely not talking to them. Talking for them, but I'll share the case study in the chat. There's a lot that's going on in terms of also private equity engaging on ESG aspects. So that's also encouraging.
Thank you, Clara. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So I come from Malaysia, and obviously palm oil is a hot topic. So we are seeing the deforestation coming down. Banks like us, we have committed to NDPE. So we don't finance unless the companies, no deforestation, no peat, and no exploitation. We also have the RSPO, a certification for palm oil. So what we need is some support from the developed countries to bring some of the downstream industries to Malaysia, to Indonesia. You know, the population is growing, we need more economic activities. The easiest thing to do is to grow more palm oil. But if we can get more downstream industries to come, have the factories in Malaysia, Indonesia, that could actually economically empower the people not to go through the deforestation route. So that's an angle we need to look at as well.
More added value.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Locally.
Thank you.
More refining and that kind of thing, or more product creation. Yeah, cosmetics, get it made there. So is there any reason why we can't make more cosmetics out there using sustainable palm oil? Yeah. Instead of having them all made in Europe?
I'm not going to answer that, but I am going to ask
say-
another question.
Okay, something to reflect on. So thank you. I think we have to end there. And, what, do we not? Or are you
Yeah,
going to say
sorry,
something?
there was
I thought you were
just
going to tell us we had to stop.
one very quick question from online to Sarah, wondering about how we can find out more about the framework that you've just talked to us about.
Sure. Well, you can go to our website, globalcanopy.org, where you can then find my email address, but it's s.rogerson@globalcanopy.org, so feel free to get in touch.
All 200 people online will be emailing you soon.
It's normally on the slides, so that's fine.
We have one final question over here.
I would simply like to ask something like your Global 500, just how effective that has been in sort of change in activities. I mean, have you seen noticeable change? Is there competition to fall off that list? Is that happening?
Yeah, so I think it kind of depends across the 500. A lot of companies and financial institutions have made a lot of progress since we started assessing them in 2014. There are still a number that still don't have any deforestation policies, don't have human rights policies, don't score for anything in our assessments. But there isn't really a trend in the company. It's not based on location, it's not based on sector, it's just specific companies and financial institutions are lagging behind. So we have seen a lot of progress in those that are already acting, and some of those ones that even in like 2019 had zero have made rapid progress in the last 2 years. And I think more companies and financial institutions are reaching out to us, they're engaging, they want to know what our assessment is and why they should care about deforestation and what they can do.
And have they been exposed by you as part of that? What's the sort of worst performing have been exposed and publicly exposed as poor performers?
Yeah, so we publish, as well as our data set, we publish a report every year that outlines kind of who the leaders are, who the laggards are, and what the general trends across the group as well. So yeah.
Thank you. Nikki has a comment on this, so is there a microphone there?
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to say to the point about contact details and one and the other. I mean, deforestation-free-finance.org lays out a 5-step guidance set, and obviously we will be linking that across to all of these tools, and so that I think is the place to go. But I would also say, since we have so many people both in the room but online as well, that the commitment that was made, there's a real call to get more financial institutions to join in this effort formally, because it obviously then creates a positive cycle and a positive cascade. And while there are 8.7 trillion, I think, assets under management, it's a very, very a respectable number. We need more banks to sign up to this commitment, and of course more investors, because that's the market signal that then gets the countries to provide the kind of financing that changes the system, and it's all really difficult, right? And I think we must also acknowledge that. We have these commitments, but my God, this problem's intractable. And I think that's why we get the sort of slightly raised eyebrows sometimes, oh, here are more commitments. Well, because it's really difficult. We've been working on this as a global community for 40 years and, you know, intensively for 15, and here we still are. So I think with the package that was laid out, now's the moment to create that critical mass, and, you know, hopefully we'll move forward. And if we don't, we're going to have to try again. You know, we're going to have to solve this problem. So I really do think now is the time to try and do that. So hopefully we'll see more commitments from financial institutions, and hopefully from some of those who are following today.
Well, I think we probably have to end our proceedings today and on this panel. So we've had a pretty interesting look at a number of sources of data and the way it can be used and the way it can be brought together. And that would be very useful because we've had this huge commitment made to end deforestation by 2030 by well over, I think it's now nearly 150 signatories to that pledge. So we're also seeing the tightening regulatory environment, such as the EU and also the UK, bringing in laws which will require companies and importers not to import illegal deforestation into products coming into the European Union and the UK. So, you know, this is just one region where the regulatory noose is tightening on this, and it's all moving in one direction. So we have to get ready. As Nikki has said, it's difficult, and it's partly difficult because demand is massive. You know, demand for palm oil around the world is sort of not going down anytime soon. It's a wonderful vegetable oil. It just has to be grown right and not by cutting down forests. But it's not the only commodity. Of course, paper and pulp and all the others. It's the same kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with the commodity itself. It's the way it is produced that's wrong. And we all have to get better at that and to be able to have good MRV of the process. But perhaps we should think in other ways and think about alternatives. I was talking just a few days ago to somebody producing vegetable oils from the sea, for instance, a new business for our friends in Norway, perhaps, but from kelp and seaweeds can be converted into vegetable oils. So could that be done on any massive scale or not? And then that would no doubt create other problems. So this is an intractable problem. We do have to do it because forests are infrastructure that keeps all our lives safe. And you know, if we tear it down at our peril. So with that, I want you to thank the panel for their contributions today. So thank you very much for everything you've done. And to thank the Ethical Finance Initiative for providing this opportunity here at Ross Priory in Scotland. And to all of those of you who are listening online, I was told some 200 of you. I'm very sorry you can't join us in the bar afterwards, but I hope you've enjoyed the proceedings, and thank you all very much. Goodbye.